Now, in our previous lecture, we had completed the bhakti movement, and now we come to Sufism. First of all, the term Sufism. The term Sufism itself came into use in a prominent manner from the 19th century onwards. Earlier, it was known as tasawwuf. Right? So, पहले इसको tasawwuf बोलते थे. From the 19th century onwards, that is from the 1800s, it came to be referred to as Sufism. Now, as for both these terms, Sufism or tasawwuf, they are both derived from the term Safa or Sufa, right? What do these terms mean? They are both Arabic words which mean a coarse, woolen blanket. A coarse woolen blanket. Now, how does this coarse woolen blanket get associated with this spiritual and social movement in the Islamic world? Now, this Sufa represented a spiritual place located outside the mosque, where the Sufi saints used to sit and meditate, right? So outside the mosque, in the public squares, the Sufi saints used to just place their sufas on the ground, sit upon it and meditate. So it was a spiritual place outside the mosque, right? And since the mosque was the physical representation of the spiritual realm within Islam, the Sufa also symbolized an alternative to the Orthodox Islamic view of things, right? And because of the ordinary material used for this Sufa, that is coarse wool, it also represented a rejection of luxury, right? And in that sense, it was a reaction to the negative developments taking place in the Islamic world, right? So this is what this simple coarse woolen blanket represented, and the saints associated with this Sufa, they were known as the Sufis, right? Now, What were these negative changes? Now, Sufism actually emerged from the 10th century onwards. Its early beginnings were in the core of the Islamic world, that is Arabia and Persia. That is Western Asia. This was also a period characterized by the decline of the Islamic Caliphate and the rise of Turkish sultanates. And with this change, there was also a major transformation in the Islamic value system. The earlier Islamic values of equality, democracy, universalism, and we can say mutualism were being discarded. Rather, the religion of Islam was co-opted by these Turkish sultanates to fulfill their own political and economic objectives, resulting in the rise of materialism in the Islamic world, accompanied by a love of luxury. The value of democracy was replaced by dynastic monarchy and the idea that all people of the world are the creations of the same God and thus enjoy the same respect and rights in the eyes of God, that was also discarded. The Turkish sultanates began using Islam to promote religious exclusivism, not only religious, but also racial and linguistic exclusivism. Further, the idea that it is the duty of the ruler to rule the subjects according to their will, that was discarded. Rather, absolute rule emerged as the new norm within the Islamic world. And in order to further maximize the resources that they could possibly command and consume, the Turkish sultans began using religion in order to justify their conquests and invasions. As a result, warfare became much more common, resulting in an increase in the general level of human suffering. And it is in reaction to these changes that Sufism emerged as a social protest against the rising materialism within the Islamic world. Okay? Now, although Sufism is often interpreted as an alternative to Orthodox Islam, in many ways, the roots of Sufism lie within the Quran itself. The Quran was traditionally interpreted in two different manners, resulting in one interpretation known as the Shariat and the other known as the Tariqat. The Shariat, which represents the orthodox interpretation of the Quran, was based upon blind faith or ibadat. That means the letter of the holy book Quran was taken literally as the interpretation. उसमें कोई reasoning involved नहीं होगा, जो लिखा है वही सच माना जाएगा. Tariqat, on the other hand, represented the liberal interpretation based on not ibadat but reasoning, that is mutazzil. Right? And it is on the basis of this liberal interpretation, tariqat, that Sufism is based. ठीक है? Now, what do you think the attitude of the Orthodox Islamic scholars and their political patrons towards Sufism was, especially in the early period? Was it favorable or was it hostile? Hostile ही रहेगा, right? So the attitude of Orthodox Islam to Sufism was rather hostile. And here we can emphasize upon two important points of difference between Sufism and Orthodox Islam. One was in the way in which the two of them interpreted the relationship between man and God. Under Orthodox Islam, the relationship between man and God is the same as the relationship between master and slave, Aka and गुलाम, ठीक है। नाउ कैन द स्लेव एवर क्लेम इक्वालिटी विद हिज मास्टर? Is there going to be any possibility of the union of soul and God? नहीं होगा. So there was no possibility of union between soul, that is ruh, and God, that is Allah. ठीक है. On the other hand, under Sufism, the relationship between man and God has been reinterpreted entirely. किस तरह से देखा जाता है? It is seen as the same as the relationship between the beloved and the lover, the mashuk and ashik. With the male element representing soul or ruh, and female element representing God or Allah. ठीक है. And like the destiny of lovers is to be unified, the destiny of soul and God is also unification. ठीक है. So the core tenet of the Sufi ideology is an idea known as the Wahadat al-Wajud, or unity of being. It is the highest objective according to Sufism. That is the unification of soul with God. ठीक है. So not only has Sufism completely reinterpreted the relationship between God and soul through the idiom of the relationship between lovers, but because it attributes the feminine attributes to God rather than the male attributes, it was doubly unacceptable to the Orthodox Islamic tradition. That is one reason why it was rejected entirely. Second factor, this we have already discussed, that by accepting the Mutazilite tradition, that is reasoning as the valid method of understanding and interpreting God, Sufism represented a rejection of which tradition? Of ibadat or faith. ठीक है. And by doing this, it automatically represented an attack on Orthodox Islam, since ibadat or faith was the very basis of Orthodox Islam. ठीक है? Thus, it represented an attack on the very foundations of Orthodox Islam. And thus, Orthodox Islam, especially in the beginning, was extremely hostile towards Sufism. Another reason for the hostility towards Sufism was because the ruling class was also hostile towards it. Why? Because of the alliance, the ruling alliance between the rulers and the Orthodox Islamic scholars. तो in the case of the Rajputs हम पढ़ते हैं ना, the Rajput Brahmin alliance, वैसे ही यहाँ पर सुल्तान और जो मुल्लाज हैं, मौलवीज हैं, उनके बीच में अलायंस था, right? Now, the ruling alliance between the rulers and the Islamic scholars also felt threatened by the democratic and rational tendencies of Sufism. And thus, even the ruling class was opposed to Sufism in the earlier period. ठीक है? And this hostility is amply visible from the treatment of Sufis by Orthodox Islamic scholars and the ruling class. Example, a 10th century Sufi saint in Persia, his name was Mansur bin Hallaj. He proclaimed that he had attained the state of Wahadat al-Wajud, that is unity of being, and declared himself to be unhaq, that is the ultimate reality. ठीक है? By doing this, what had he done? He had emerged as a new pole around which the masses could gather, thus stripping away, eroding the support base of the traditional Orthodox Islamic aristocracy as well as the ruling class. And thus, his very existence became problematic. Therefore, he was sentenced to death and burnt alive. Right? So this was the first occasion when the tensions between Sufism and Orthodox Islam came to the forefront, right? Now, because of the popularity of Sufism among the common people, although the ruling class and the Orthodox Islamic aristocracy remained opposed to it, it never completely vanished, right? And it was in the 12th century that another Sufi saint, Al-Ghazali, struck a compromise between Sufism and Orthodox Islam. As part of this compromise, what did he do? He said that both ibadat and tariqat were valid means to understand the true nature of God. As such, both Shariat and both Shariat and Tariqat were also valid interpretations of the Quran. And by doing this, while he had continued to emphasize upon the Muntazilite or Tariqat tradition of Islam, he had also given legitimacy to the Orthodox Islamic interpretation of Islam, that is the Shariat, based on faith, that is Ibadat. Thus, the threat perception of Sufism among the Orthodox Islamic community and scholars that reduced, and the attitude and their attitude towards the Sufis that was softened to a degree. Now, while in the long run, what was the impact of this compromise on the Islamic community as a whole? Positive or negative? नेगेटिव इम्पैक्ट पड़ा. क्यों? क्योंकि रैशनैलिटी को अब डाइल्यूट कर दिया गया था. द बेसिस फॉर द इस्लामिक सोसाइटी, which if this conflict had continued may have emerged as a highly rational one, scientific one, that could not take place in the long run due to the dilution of the rational tradition. The Islamic world suffered, but in the short term, this compromise provided much needed respite to the Sufis. Is this clear? And from this period onwards, two types of Sufis emerged. One known as the Beshara and the other known as the Bashara. Beshara were the ones who continued to recognize only and only the validity of the Muttazil path and the Tariqat interpretation, rejecting the Shariat interpretation based on blind faith. तो उनको बेशरियत या बेशरा बोल दिया गया. And the other Bashara, those who accepted the validity of both these paths and traditions. Mutazzil also and Ibadat also. Tariqat also and Shariat also. समझ में आया है ये? The Besharas were also known as Kalandars. Or wanderers. Now, obviously, the ruling class is not going to allow them to establish deep roots and establish any permanent institutions. Therefore, they would constantly move from one place to the other, meditating and preaching. They would gather followers, but they would never have any permanent place of residence. On the other hand, the attitude of the ruling class towards the Bashara Sufis was quite different. They began establishing their own Silsilahs or orders. तो यानी कि अपने खुद के institutions बनाने लग गए, अपने permanent places of residence बनाने लग गए. So they started organizing themselves into orders or Silsilahs. These were monastic orders. तो monasteries बनाने लग गए and began constructing places of residence and worship known as khankas or khangas. This was the hospice. Okay. Now, as for India, Sufis began arriving in India right from the beginning of Turkish invasions and conquests. Who was the first prominent Turkish invader and conqueror? Mahmud Ghazni. Now, while he did not establish a large empire covering the whole of North India, he did establish or he did bring the region of Punjab under his control, especially northern Punjab. And it was during his reign in the early 11th century that the first Sufi saint arrived in Punjab. His name was Al-Hujwiri. Also known as Data Ganj Baksh. who wrote the famous text Kashf ul Mahjub in Persian and established the early foundations of the Sufi tradition in India. However, with the decline of Ghaznavid power, the influx of Sufis also stopped. Okay? After Al-Hajwiri, for almost 200 years, there was no other prominent Sufi saint. The next phase of Sufi onset or advent is going to take place in the context of the Ghurid invasions and conquests. In fact, even before Muhammad Ghori established his control over Delhi and Rajasthan, during the reign of Prithviraj Chauhan III itself, during the late 12th century, Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti established his Khangah at Ajmer. And after his death, his Khangah became a prominent dargah. Okay, that is place of pilgrimage. He had a number of prominent followers such as Kutubuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, Hamiduddin Nagori, and Baba Farid Ganje Shakar, who established their own khangahs at different locations in northern and western India. Kutubuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki at Delhi, Hamiduddin Nagori at Nagaur in Rajasthan, and Baba Farid at Ajodhan in Punjab. Okay? And with the second generation of Chishti Sufi saints, the Chishti Sufi Silsila emerged as a well-established Sufi order in North India. Clear? Later, other prominent Chishti Sufi saints carried on the legacy of these earlier Chishti saints and contributed to the Chishti Sufi Silsila emerging as the most dominant Silsila in India. These included Nizamuddin Aulia, Nasiruddin Chirag Dehlvi, and Gesu Daraz. Bande Nawaz. While Nizamuddin Aulia and Chirag Dehlvi were based out of Delhi, Gesu Daraz or Bande Nawaz was the first Chishti Sufi saint to establish his Khanga in the Deccan region at Gulbarga. Is this clear? Now, apart from the Chishti Sufi Silsila, there were other prominent Silsilahs as well. Abul Fazl in the Aine Akbari, for example, mentions that there were 14 different Sufi Silsilahs in the empire of Akbar, operating in the empire of Akbar. Some of these included the Suhrawardi Silsila, established by Bahauddin Zakaria and popularized in India by one of his followers, Shahabuddin Suhrawardi. After him, the Silsila was named. Now, while the Chishti Sufi saints maintained a distant relationship with the ruling class, rather they positioned themselves as the advocates and representatives of the common people of India. The Suhrawardi Silsila maintained close relationships with the ruling class. Another important point of difference was the attitude of the Suhrawardis towards luxurious life, right? The Chishti Sufi saints adopted the idiom al fakro fakri, मुझे अपनी फकीरी पे फकर है, right? I am proud of my poverty. They wanted to establish closer relations with the common people, with the poor people of India, and thus rejected luxury as a way of life. The Suhrawardis, on the other hand, emphasized that if we were ourselves to remain poor, we will not be able to fulfill our remit, that is of serving the common people. So first we need to enrich ourselves, only then we can serve the poor. Some other silsilas such as the Naqshbandi silsila, the Qadri silsila, they were both liberal Sufi orders. Then the Kubrawiya silsila, which was prominent primarily in Kashmir, but unlike the other Sufi silsilas, which adopted a tolerant view towards non-Muslims, the Kubrawiya silsila adopted a very hostile view. They wanted forcible conversions, destruction of temples, imposition of jizya, etc. Right? In contrast, in Kashmir, another liberal Sufi tradition known as the Rishi tradition also emerged with prominent saints such as Nuruddin Rishi. We have already mentioned him in the context of Lal Ded, right? So they were a traditional liberal Sufi silsila which called for peaceful coexistence and religious toleration. They called for the equality of all religions. Okay? Now, out of all these, the Chishtis remained the most popular Sufi order in India. Why do you think this was? Firstly, the Chishtis developed close contacts with the common people of India. They lived and worked among them and emerged as their advocates and representatives. Secondly, the Chishtis emphasized upon the use of local languages such as Avdi, Punjabi, Urdu, Deccani, etc., which made them even more popular among the common people. Thirdly, the Chishtis publicly rejected any direct association with the ruling class, and thus, in the eyes of the people, the Chishtis were accepted as their champions. Fourthly, the Chishtis accepted both Muslim and Hindu disciples. Both Muslim and Hindu followers. And because of their tolerant attitude towards Hindus, who formed the bulk of the population, they were able to increase their following. This was another reason for their popularity. And even among Hindus, they did not discriminate on the basis of caste. So the Chishtis adopted a tolerant view of the lower castes and actively engaged with them. For example, Nizamuddin Aulia was the first Chishti Sufi saint to establish close contact with the Nathpanthi yogis, and the Nathpanthis even gave him the title of Siddha, that is the perfect yogi, and thus he had brought the followers of the Nathpanthis under the umbrella of Chishti Sufism automatically. Okay? So this was another reason for their popularity. And sixthly, in order to spread their message, they often used symbols, idioms, and stories which were popular among the local Hindu population. Okay? So these were stories that these communities had grown up with over generations, and it was through these that the Chishtis always spread their message. So the use of stories, symbolism, and idioms from Hindu households widened their appeal further. This was the reason that Sufis were more popular than any of the other Chishti Sufi. Chishtis were more popular than the other Sufi Silsilahs. Okay? Now, when it comes to the Sufi ideology, what are the things that we should know? क्या क्या पता होना चाहिए हमें? First of all, the highest objective in Sufism is the attainment of Wahadat al-Wajud. That is unity of being. Between man and God. Those who attain this state are known as Al-Haq, or the ultimate reality. But for this, an individual must cross through 7 spiritual valleys or dairas. Seven spiritual valleys or dairas. That means he must elevate his spirit through 7 levels to attain this ultimate state of al-haq by coming to the realization of wahadat al-wajud. And in this spiritual journey, the individual requires the guidance of a teacher, that is peer, also known as haq. Teacher or leader. And these teachers or leaders establish their own silsilahs. That is their own monastic order. That is an institution for the followers of these Sufi saints, peers or haqs, in which they spiritually and morally guide their followers, known as murshids or darwish. Murshid means pupil and darwish means servant. So these pupils are the servants of both their teachers as well as God. And once a peer ends his mortal journey, he overcomes what is known as Visalayar. That is the pain of separation. Sufis क्या बोलते हैं? बच्चा पैदा कैसे होता है? हंसते हुए, रोते हुए? रोते हुए पैदा होता है। वाई इज अ चाइल्ड ऑलवेज बॉर्न क्राइंग? बिकॉज एट बर्थ ही हैज बीन separated from his mashuk, from his beloved. The soul has been ripped apart from God, right? ये वहादत वजूद का जो स्टेट है वो डिसॉल्व हो जाता है, एंड दिस लीड्स टू दी पैंग्स ऑफ सेपरेशन, द पेन ऑफ सेपरेशन। इसको बोलते हैं, इस पेन ऑफ सेपरेशन को, विसाल है यार। क्लियर है? एंड मरने के बाद क्या होता है? Those who have attained this status, those who have realized Wahadat al-Wajud, they are reunified with God. So they go back to their beloved, to their Mashuk. And thus, death of a Sufi saint, is it an occasion for mourning or is it an occasion for celebration? Celebration. तो ऐसा बनाया जाता है कि शादी हो गई दोबारा से, ठीक है, दोबारा से मिल रहे हैं. That and the death anniversary of a Sufi saint is known as Urs. After the death of a Sufi saint, his mausoleum or tomb often emerges as a place of pilgrimage. It is known as Dargah or Mazar. And the task of leading the Silsilah and providing spiritual guidance to the other followers is now going to be undertaken by the successor of that Sufi saint. So this successor is known as Wali. That is the spiritual successor of the Sufi saint. Now, within Sufism, another concept emerged, that spiritual elevation can not only be obtained through traversing those spiritual valleys or dairas, but also by receiving the spiritual grace of the Sufi Peer. And this spiritual grace was known as Barkat or Sabab. तो हिंदी में इसका इक्विवेलेंट होता है पुण्य कमाना, राइट? दैट इज spiritual grace. And spiritual grace of the Sufi saint can also be attained by visiting his grave site, his place of burial, in the form of a ritualized pilgrimage. This pilgrimage is known as ziyarat. वही pilgrimage, the act of going to the Sufi saint's dargah is known as ziyarat, pilgrimage को. तो ये एक जरिया है बरकत कमाने का. Another method by which barakat could be attained is by making donations, giving dan dakshina, right? That is known as Futu. This is an unsolicited gift made by the followers to the Sufi Silsilahs. ठीक है? Now, one way in which the Murshids or the dervishes can come closer to God is by destroying their sense of distinct self. तो अपने खुद की consciousness को अगर destroy कर दोगे, what is going to be left? The ultimate reality, that is God. And this sense of this element of self annihilation is known as fana. Now, one of the ways in which this self annihilation or fana can be obtained, at least for a fleeting moment, at least momentarily, is by achieving the state of intense ecstasy or hal. That is such intense joy that इसमें केवल भगवान दिखेंगे और कुछ नहीं दिखेगा, right? So you lose sense of yourself. And how to do that? How to attain this state of hala? By performing kawwali, that is devotional singing, and along with that, गाने के साथ क्या होता है हमेशा? नाचना, right? That is raksh. और डांस. ठीक है? तो सूफी दरविशेस यू मस्ट हैव सीन कैसे नाचते हैं, ऐसे करके गोल 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 घूमते रहते हैं. तो होता क्या होगा उसमें, चक्कर आता होगा, गिर जाते होंगे, एंड वो बोल दिया कि हाला का स्टेट अचीव हो गया. दे हैव डिस्ट्रॉयड ऑल सेंस ऑफ सेल्फ. दे हैव अटेन्ड सेल्फ annihilation, and thus for a short moment they have obtained wahadat al wajud. That is the feeling, that is the state that they must constantly work towards. तो अभी समझ में आया है थ्रू द यूज ऑफ दीज टर्म्स सूफी आइडियोलॉजी. चलिए, गुड. नाउ as for the contributions of Sufism, what are the things that we can highlight? क्या क्या बोल सकते हैं, बताओ. What was the experience of the indigenous Indian Hindu community with early Islam? Was it a positive one or a negative one? Negative one, right? Because Islamic rule had been established through violent conquest. So the Hindu community had a bad memory of this great trauma, right? And it was Sufism which introduced the softer side of Islam. एंड इस्लाम के लिए रियल फाउंडेशंस दस सूफिज्म ने एस्टैब्लिश किया. सेकेंडली, व्हाट एल्स? Sufism also played a very important role in making Islamic rule acceptable to the people. And they did this in two ways. Firstly, by making Islam itself acceptable, right? They introduced the softer side of Islam. And secondly, by acting as a checking mechanism against the excesses of the Islamic State. That means making their rule less tyrannical and less exploitative. They acted as a check against state excess. Thirdly, they also played a very important role in social integration. कैसे? Not only by reducing the horizontal divide which had emerged with the advent of Islam and division of the Indian society into Hindus and Muslims, by bridging the gap between Hindus and Muslims. And this also they did in both ways, by making Islam acceptable to the Hindus and by making Muslims more tolerant towards the Hindus. They popularized stories from the households of Hindus and showed the Muslims that they are actually not all that different. So Hindus के दिल में भी के सीने में भी same दिल धड़कता है. That the same values which appeal to the Muslims of India also appeal to the Hindus of India, right? In fact, they also co-opted some of the cruel vocabulary of the early Islam in India. For example, the term kafir. Kafir का मतलब क्या होता है traditionally? Non-believer, right? And what is the kind of treatment that is reserved for a non-believer? उसके लिए कोई जगह है? नहीं है. He has to be given two choices, either convert or die. Eliminate करना है उसको किसी भी कीमत पर. That was adopted by the Sufis in their popular songs and poems. काफिर को redefine किया गया. जब काफिर बोला जाता है तो उसको किससे equate किया जाता है? An object of love, an object of desire. उसको भगवान से जोड़ा जाता है, अल्लाह से जोड़ा जाता है, right? तो तेरी काफिराना आंखें, for example, right? कोई सेंस बनता है उसका? नहीं बनता है. But by redefining the term kafir, they also softened the attitude of Muslims towards Hindus, towards the kafirs. तो एक तो इस तरह से किया इन्होंने, they bridged the gap between Hindus and Muslims. And secondly, by engaging the lower castes, they also reduced the vertical division of the society to a large extent. Not only by engaging the lower castes, but even all the classes, upper class as well as lower class. Okay? So socio-economic integration as well as religious integration was brought about by the Sufis. Fourthly, The Sufis also played a very important role in linguistic development. कैसे? They promoted the use of local languages, and their followers introduced a new style of literature known as the Malfuzat literature. All of it was that was written in the local languages, regional languages. Similarly, the Sufis played a very important economic role. How? First of all, where did most of the Sufis establish their khangas? In the middle of cities or in far-flung remote areas? Far-flung remote areas. So they established their khangas in remote areas. And because of their popularity, they began gathering a large number of followers who began to arrive in these remote areas and settled around the khangas. They began clearing the forest, reclaiming the land, and spreading agriculture. By doing this, the Sufis played an indirect role in agrarian expansion. Secondly, they received a large amount of donations in the form of futu. They did not hoard it, rather they reinvested their accumulated wealth in both primary and secondary economic activities. So they emerged as the prominent bankers of their age. And thirdly, the Sufi khangas and dargahs emerged not only as spiritual places but also as a meeting place for merchants. Okay? So the Sufi khangas initially used to house the followers who used to visit them. As their popularity grew outside the Sufi khangas, also rest houses, inns, kitchens, they are going to come up. Then entire markets are going to develop. As these markets grow, because of the importance of the Sufi, spiritual importance of the Sufi Silsilah and its growing economic importance, the trade routes connecting these market centers to other similar market centers are going to become busier. तो पूरा का पूरा एक नया ट्रेड नेटवर्क एस्टैब्लिश करवा देंगे सूफी सिलसिलास. So they also played an important role in the promotion of trade and commerce. Similarly, the Sufis also played an important role in cultural development. कैसे? By contributing to the growth of music, dance, painting, architecture, and literature, especially poetry. Not only in the traditional elite mediums, that is Farsi and Arabic, but also in the regional languages. So they also contributed in the growth of regional culture. And not only this, but the Sufis also played an important role in regional integration. Prominent Sufi dargahs attracted travelers from distant regions. Thus, the Sufis contributed to growing physical contact through pilgrimage. Secondly, by encouraging the growth of secondary economic activities such as craft production and trade, they also encouraged regional economic integration. Or rather, I should have said economic integration between different regions or inter-regional economic integration. Okay? Thirdly, by popularizing similar themes and stories, similar beliefs across a wider landscape, they brought about the ideological unification of these varied regions. Okay? So, these are the various contributions of Sufism. Clear है? Now, जल्दी से इस सबको लिख भी लेते हैं. You guys can tell me क्या लिखवाने की जरूरत नहीं है, क्या लिखवाने की जरूरत है. ठीक है? Now, first give the heading Sufism. लिखो. The term Sufism first emerged in a popular manner from the 19th century onwards. From the 19th century onwards. Full stop. Earlier, the term tasawwuf, यहाँ पे लिखा हुआ है, tasawwuf was prevalent. Stop. Both are derived from the Arabic word safa or sufa. Safa or sufa, written over here. Which means a coarse woolen blanket. Coarse woolen blanket. Full stop. Next point. The sufa represented a spiritual place outside the mosque on which saints used to sit and meditate. Full stop. In the same point, continue. Therefore, the Sufa symbolized an alternative to the Orthodox Islamic worldview. To the Orthodox Islamic worldview. Full stop. Next point. The Sufa also represented the ascetic tradition or renunciant tradition within Islam. क्या लिखा है अभी? Sufa also represented the ascetic or renunciant tradition with Islam and stood for the rejection of luxury. The rejection of luxury. As such, it emerged. As such, Sufism emerged. As such, Sufism emerged as a reaction to quote unquote negative developments. Negative within quotes. Negative developments taking place in the Islamic world. Full stop. Next main point. Sufism as a religious ideology and practice first emerged in West Asia from the 10th century onwards. From the 10th century onwards. Full stop. Sub point. This period coincided with the decline of the Islamic Caliphate. And the rise of Turkish sultanates. Full stop. Next sub point. The value system of the Islamic society also underwent a major change. Full stop. In the same subpoint, continue. Power, wealth, influence, and luxury completely overshadowed the egalitarianism, democracy, and universalism of early Islam. Of early Islam. Next subpoint. Therefore, Sufism emerged as a social protest. Emerged as a social protest against the rising materialism within the Islamic world. Within the Islamic world. ठीक है? सब हेडिंग दो. Ideological basis of Sufism and its conflict with Orthodox Islam. Its conflict with Orthodox Islam. Write down. In one sense, main point. In one sense, comma, Sufism is based upon the Quran itself. Based upon the Quran itself. Full stop. Subpoint. Traditionally, the Quran had two different interpretations. Had two different interpretations. Write down. The Shariat and the Tariqat. The Shariat and the Tariqat. Next subpoint लिखो. The Shariat represents the orthodox interpretation based upon ibadat within brackets faith. Orthodox interpretation based upon ibadat or faith. In other words, full stop. In other words, it represents the narrow literal interpretation of the Quran. Next subpoint. On the other hand, Tariqat represents the liberal interpretation of the Quran based upon mutazzil within brackets reasoning. Mutazzil or reasoning, based upon mutazzil or reasoning. Full stop. Therefore, it is the rational, non non uh, uh, rational, non-literal interpretation of Islam. Full stop. It is based upon observation, analysis, and personal experience. Full stop. Next subpoint. Sufism is based upon the latter. Sufism is based upon the latter, that is tariqat. Latter or tariqat. All right? Clear है इतना? Next point. Next main point. Understandably, Orthodox Islam was hostile towards Sufism. Full stop. This hostility was due to the following factors. 1, 2, and 3. Number 1. Orthodox Islam and Sufism interpreted the relationship between man and God in a completely different manner. Full stop. Subpoint. While Shariat perceives it as a master slave. मास्टर के आगे ब्रैकेट में आका और स्लेव के आगे गुलाम. As a master slave relation, master aka and gulam, slave gulam relation while Shariat perceives perceives it as a master slave relation and rejects the possibility of union and equality between soul, ruh, and God, Allah. Between soul and God, ruh and Allah. Full stop. Next point. Sufism perceives this relationship as the one between lovers, as the one between lovers, with God representing the beloved or mashuk, and soul representing the lover or ashik, who has been separated from his beloved, who has been separated from his beloved. Full stop. Therefore, the ultimate objective in Sufism is wahadat al-wajud. Wahadat al-wajud. That is unity of being. Unity of being. This was one factor why Orthodox Islam was hostile towards Sufism. Second, second, पहला वाला लिख लिया ना आपने. Second, by emphasizing upon the mutazzil, within brackets, rational tradition, Sufism represented a rejection of the ibadat tradition, of the ibadat or faith tradition. Full stop. Therefore, it attacked the very roots of Orthodox Islam. It attacked the very roots of Orthodox Islam. ठीक है? And number 3, the ruling alliance composed of the sultans and the ulema felt threatened by the democratic and rational tendencies of Sufism. Full stop. Thus, it remained hostile towards Sufism. Full stop. The 10th century Arabic Sufi slave, the 10th century Arabic Sufi saint Mansour bin Hallaj. Mansour bin Hallaj was sentenced to death and burnt alive when he publicly proclaimed himself to be Anhalq. ANLHEQ. Anhalq. That is the ultimate reality. Next point. This was the first instance that tensions between Orthodox Islam and Sufism came to the forefront in a prominent manner. Came to the forefront in a prominent manner. Full stop. Over the next 2 centuries, these tensions continued escalating as Sufism gained popularity among the common masses. Due to its egalitarian and reformative approach. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. Finally, in the 12th century, the Sufi saint Al-Ghazali struck a compromise with Orthodox Islam. Full stop. Sub point. By recognizing the validity of both the Mutazzil and the Ibadat tradition, as valid methods to learn the true nature of God and his creation. He validated both the Shariat and Tariqat interpretations of the Quran. Of the Quran. Full stop. Next point. While in the long run, comma, the dilution of the rational credentials of Sufism proved harmful for the Islamic world. Comma. In the short term, this compromise provided much needed breathing room to Sufism, which was coming under increasing pressure from the ruling class. ठीक है? Next point लिखो, next main point. With this compromise, a split occurred within Sufism. And two traditions emerged. A split occurred within Sufism and two traditions emerged. Number one, Beshara, who continued to reject the validity of the Shariat interpretation. सब पॉइंट लिखो इसी के अंदर. They understandably were not accepted by the Orthodox Islamic ruling class. And thus were forced to become Kalandars or Fakirs. Meaning wanderers. ठीक है? Next, number 2, second tradition, Bashara, who accepted the validity of Shariat and were thus accepted by the Orthodox Islamic ruling class. Full stop. They established their own monastic orders or silsilahs. Monastic orders or silsilahs. And constructed their hospices known as khanka or khangas. Known as khanka or khanga. खानगाह, जैसे दरगाह होता है वैसे ही खानगाह. ठीक है. नेक्स्ट सब हेडिंग गिव Sufism in India. Sufism in India. Stop. Write down. Sufis began arriving in India right from the period of early Turkish invasions and conquests. Early Turkish invasions and conquests under the Ghaznavids. Under the Ghaznavids. Full stop. सब पॉइंट लिखो. The first Sufi saint in India was Al-Hujwiri. Was Al-Hujwiri, also known as Data Ganj Baksh. Who arrived in Punjab in the early 11th century, shortly after its conquest by Mahmud Ghaznavi. By Mahmud Ghaznavi. Full stop. Next sub point. He laid the foundations of Sufism, the early foundations of Sufism, in Punjab. And wrote the Kashf-ul-Mahjub. In Persian. Next point लिखो. Next main point. However, with the decline of Ghaznavid power, the further growth of Sufism did not take place. Did not take place. Full stop. The next major development came in the form of the arrival of Moinuddin Chishti at Ajmer. Moinuddin Chishti at Ajmer during the Ghurid invasions. During the Ghurid invasions in the late 12th century. In the late 12th century. Full stop. Next point. His followers, including Kutubuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, within brackets Delhi, Hamiduddin Nagori, within brackets Nagaur, and Baba Fariduddin Ganj Shakar, within brackets Ajodhan. हमीदुद्दीन नागौरी, नागौर एक जगह है राजस्थान में, तो उसके ऊपर इनका नाम हमीदुद्दीन नागौरी था. हमीदुद्दीन नागौरी within brackets Nagaur, and Baba Farid or Baba Fariduddin Ganj e Shakar, within brackets Ajodhan. Ajodhan is a place in Punjab. क्या लिखा है? His followers, including these three people, established the Chishti Sufi Silsila, as a prominent and popular order, in northern and western India. ठीक है. ये जो पर्सनालिटीज हैं, which century are they associated with? 13th century, especially the early 13th century. Now, during this period, another major development was taking place in the larger context of Asian history. और वो क्या था? The expansion of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols burst out of China onto the stage of Central and Western Asia. पूरे के पूरी एशिया में आग लगा दी. And as a result, a number of Sufis from Central and Western Asia also began migrating towards India. They started fleeing towards India, seeking refuge. Right? So during this period, there was a great spurt of Sufi activity in India because of the heavy influx of Sufis who were trying to escape the Mongol problem. Write down. During the early 13th century, main point. During the early 13th century, a large number of Sufis arrived in India while trying to escape the Mongol menace in Central and Western Asia. In Central and Western Asia, while trying to escape the Mongol menace in Central and Western Asia. Clear? Next main point likho. During the 14th and 15th centuries, during the 14th and 15th centuries, Chishti saints such as Nizamuddin Aulia and Nasiruddin Chirage Dehelvi, Nizamuddin Aulia and Nasiruddin Chirage Dehelvi established the Chishti Silsila as the most popular one in North India. In North India, and Gesudaraz Bande Nawaz also introduced it in the Deccan. Also introduced it in the Deccan. Within brackets, Gulbarga. Next main point likho. Apart from the Chishtis, there were several other Sufi Silsilahs. Full stop. In the Aine-Akbari, Abul Fazl mentions the existence of 14 different Sufi Silsilahs, including the Suhrawardis, Naqshbandis, Qadris, Kubrawiyas, and Rishis. Qadris, Kubrawiyas, and Rishis. Next subpoint. However, none of them could reach the level of the Chishtis, in the matter of popular appeal. ठीक है? Give another subheading. Factors behind the popularity of the Chishtis. Factors behind the popularity of the Chishtis. Number 1. The Chishtis established close contacts with the common people. Full stop. They lived and worked upon them. They lived and worked upon them. Sorry, lived and worked among them. Among them. As ordinary people. As ordinary people. Full stop. Thus, they appeared more approachable and accessible. More approachable and accessible. Number 2, accessible. Accessible. Number 2, the Chishtis emphasized upon the use of local languages. The use of local languages. And thus, their reach among the people was automatically greater. Was automatically greater. Number 3, by rejecting any direct association with the ruling class, any direct association with the ruling class, and often publicly criticizing the rulers, comma, the Chishtis emerged as champions of the common people. Champions of the common people. Next, number 4, the Chishtis also accepted both Hindu and Muslim followers. Both Hindu and Muslim followers, providing the basis for religious tolerance and harmony. This was much needed. Especially in the context of the deep religious divide, hostility, and history of violence shared by these communities. Next, number 5, the Chishtis. समझ में आया ना? The Chishtis also adopted a tolerant view of the lower castes and actively engaged them. Thus, they were able to widen their social footprint. Last वाला लिखो, number 6. Finally, comma, by adopting the popular symbols, stories, narratives, and idioms from Hindu households, they were able to creatively co-opt India's rich popular culture for their social and spiritual mission. This also brought the bulk of the Indian population within bracket Hindus closer to them automatically. ठीक है? I don't think कि मुझे ये आपको लिखवाने की जरूरत है. जो सूफी आइडियोलॉजी से रिलेटेड वेरियस टर्म्स हैं ये मैंने एक्सप्लेन कर दिए हैं एंड आई एम श्योर यू मस्ट हैव ऑल copied them as well. अगर कोई बीच में रह गया हो टर्म, so you guys can let me know. Do you want me to dictate any of these terms for you, or can we move ahead? Say, online students, I'm waiting for you guys to respond. Number 10 और 15 वाला क्या है? नंबर 10 वली होता है स्पिरिचुअल सक्सेसर. तो हर सिलसिला में at the top is going to be the peer. You can also consider him to be the guru. अब गुरु के नीचे कई सारे चेले होंगे, right? Some of them will have reached higher levels of spiritual growth and some of them would be novices. अभी नौसिखिया आए हुए हैं इनके नीचे, right? Now, among those who have attained a higher level of spiritual growth, the peer or guru can name one or more of them as his spiritual successor. So after his death, they are going to become the next leaders of the silsila. ठीक है? So that is wali. तो जो spiritual successor of the peer होता है, that is known as wali. Number 15, hala. Hala represents a state of ecstasy, a state of intense joy, और इतना जोर से pleasure feel होता है that the individual loses all sense of themselves, right? And when you lose self consciousness, you have attained or you have committed fana, right? तेरे प्यार में फना हो गए. So that is the idea. You have annihilated your sense of self. And since you have annihilated your sense of self, the sense that you exist as a distinct form of life, which is separate from the entire creative, wider creation and God, तो फिर क्या बचता है? The only consciousness that remains is that you are one with God. So for a short moment, you attain or you experience Wahadat al Wajud. That is the unity of being. ठीक है प्रतीक? और लास्ट वाला, Raksh is dance. So one of the ways in which this state of hala or ecstasy can be attained is by engaging in singing, devotional singing and dancing. That is going to create that feeling of intense joy. So वो hala के state को attain करने का ये जरिया है, कव्वाली और रक्ष. Okay? चलिए. And finally, the contributions of Sufism. So give the subheading, contributions of Sufism. Write down. Number 1, Sufism made Islam acceptable to Indians. Acceptable to Indians. Full stop. It represented the softer side of Islam. It represented the softer side of Islam and proved to be an ointment to the indigenous consciousness which had undergone the trauma of aggressive Islamic invasions. Undergone the trauma of aggressive Islamic invasions. ठीक है? Number 2, it also made Islamic rule acceptable to the people. By A and B. By A, acceptable to the people. By A, making Islam itself acceptable. And B, by acting as a check against excesses by the Islamic ruling class, by the Islamic state. as a check against excesses by the Islamic ruling class. Number 3, main point. Sufism also played a prominent role in social integration by A and B. A, reducing the horizontal division of society by bridging the gap between Hindus and Muslims. By bridging the gap between Hindus and Muslims. Full stop. They did this not only by transforming the attitude of Hindus towards Islam, but also by reducing the intolerance of Muslims towards Hindus. And B likho. B. Further, by overlooking the class and caste differences and accepting followers from all backgrounds, the Sufis also contributed to the reduction of Indian society's vertical division. Indian society's vertical division. Number 4 likho. Sufism also played a prominent role in linguistic development. Full stop. Under their influence, comma, regional languages such as Awadhi, Punjabi, Rajasthani, Urdu, and Dakhni growed rapidly. Regional languages such as these growed rapidly. Full stop. This was due to their emphasis on the use of these languages, not only for preaching but also for literary expression. For literary expression. Okay. Next, number 5. The economic contribution of the Sufis could also not be overlooked. Could also not be overlooked. Subpoint. By establishing khangas, in remote areas, comma, they encouraged the settlement of these regions and the expansion of agriculture in them. The expansion of agriculture in them. Next subpoint. The Sufi khangas accumulated vast resources through gifts and donations, and began lending them towards both agricultural and secondary economic activities. Next subpoint. The Sufi khangas and dargahs also emerged as meeting places for merchants, thus encouraging the growth of trade, formation of trade networks, creation of markets, and urban growth. Formation of trade networks, emergence of markets, and the growth of urban centers, the growth of urbanism. ठीक है. Next, number 6. Similarly, the Sufis played an important role in cultural development. especially in the fields of music, dance, painting, architecture, and literature. ठीक है? And not only cultural development but also cultural synthesis. Why? Because they borrowed freely from indigenous culture. Right? So write down. Further, their free borrowing from indigenous culture, also contributed to growing cultural synthesis. Last, number 7. Sufism also played a major role in the regional integration of India. In the regional integration of India. Full stop. This became possible through the following mediums. Subpoints A, B, C. A. Physical contact through pilgrimage. B. Economic integration of different regions through the growth of long distance trade. And C. Ideological integration of different regions through the popularization of similar ideas, themes, and narratives. Okay? This is Sufism. Now, a question. Analyze the factors for the greater popularity of Chishti Sufism as compared to other sects. Full stop. Discuss the role of Sufism in social integration. 200 words. 15 मार्क्स हो जाएगा. वी हैव कवर्ड बोथ दीज अंडर डिफरेंट सब हेडिंग्स. पर क्वेश्चन पढ़ लीजिए, यू कैन डू इट और नॉट. अदर सेक्ट्स तो जैसे कि नक्शबंदी सिलसिला हो गया, कुबराविया सिलसिला हो गया, इन सब के मुकाबले में चिश्ती सूफिज्म ज्यादा पॉपुलर क्यों था? सो वी हैव डिस्कस फॉर द फैक्टर्स फॉर द पॉपुलैरिटी ऑफ द चिश्ती सिलसिला ना, तो वही यहाँ पे आपको एक्सपेंड करना है. एंड रोल प्लेड बाय सूफिज्म इन सोशल इंटीग्रेशन, दैट विल बी एबल टू डू. वर्टिकल डिवाइड भी एड्रेस किया, रीजनल डिवाइड भी एड्रेस किया और हॉरिजॉन्टल डिवाइड भी एड्रेस किया इन्होंने. ठीक है. You can highlight the limitations of the other sects by focusing upon the individual factors which were responsible for the popularity of the चिश्ती सूफी movement. कि देखो, एक तो चिश्तीज में वो जो सिलसिला बनते थे, they emerged as more robust institutions. ठीक है. सेकेंडली, जो पॉपुलर थीम्स थी वो चिश्तीज ने ज्यादा अच्छे से अडॉप्ट करी. Thirdly, Chishti Sufism did not remain confined only to the political center. जो फिर उसके बाद जो स्पिरिट है चिश्ती सूफिज्म का, दैट इज ओपननेस, दैट इज वन ऑफ टॉलरेंस, द यूनिवर्सल फीलिंग ऑफ लव एटसेट्रा, राइट? So that is why Chishti Sufism was more popular as compared to others. So you don't need to specifically mention the weaknesses of others. You need to only highlight the strengths of the Chishti Silsila, and thus indirectly you will be making a comment regarding the weaknesses of other silsilas. ठीक है, तो उसको डायरेक्टली नहीं एड्रेस करना है, इनडायरेक्टली करना है. ऑलराइट, so that is it for today, guys. So Bhakti and Sufi both we have covered, and in our next lecture we'll be beginning with Mughal history. ठीक है, तो अगले लेक्चर में मुगल हिस्ट्री करेंगे. Shall I end this lecture? All right. Thank you. Thank you.